Now we're going to move on to the actual first panel of the day. This panel is about bankability. So I'm going to ask Michael and the rest of the panelists to join me at the stage here, so we can get ready. As we mentioned before, bankability is an essential part of this. We have composed a panel that includes bankability for P3 projects. They're going to take a deep dive on the financial aspects, but we have also a resiliency part related to finance and bankability. The panel is moderated by Michael, who is Vice President with FirstBank and a seasoned banker locally, and I think no better person than Michael to lead the way here. So thank you all, and Michael, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning to everybody. Happy to be here today. And thank you for the invitation to moderate what I think is going to be one of the interesting panels of these 2 days that we have here. And we have a very unique group of panelists here. Happy to say people with some experiences, obviously outside of not just Puerto Rico, but in areas in particular that are outside of what I'll call the financing scope. But the topic we're going to talk about this morning, we're going to spend some time on, is one I think that everybody has been very interested in understanding because it's such a very integral part of what will make these transactions happen. And it's what we've referred to as bankability, right? The bankability, what's the ability of these P3 projects to go to the capital markets or the bank markets or the equity markets to find the financing that will make these projects that are so important to the administration's plan and to Puerto Rico's restructuring efforts happen. So let me just real quickly here introduce the three panelists we have today. I'm not going to read their entire bio. They're gentlemen who have a lot of experience, so if I were to go through the entire bio, I think we would probably use up most of our time. But it's a very, I think, a great group to have talk about this topic today. So to my left here is Jean-Marie van der Elst, and who's a very well-traveled man. He's been in a lot of different places, born in Belgium, spent a lot of time in South Africa, but has been currently located now in Florida. But he is the director in Berkeley Research Group, LLC, Latin American Global Investigations and Strategic Intelligence, Corporate Finance and Construction Practices, and is based in, today he's based in Miami. His offices are in Miami. He's a doctoral candidate at the BIS School of Business, Florida Institute of Technology, holds a master's degree, Economics and Finance, from University of Port Elizabeth in South Africa, a Bachelor of Arts from the International Economics University of Port Elizabeth, South Africa, and a Bachelor of Economics and Psychology from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. So he's got a lot of experience there. Next to Jean-Marie is Francisco Brugueras, who is our Puerto Rico contingent representative today. Francisco is Vice President, Infrastructure Banking Group at Goldman Sachs. He's managed over $10 billion of financings for municipal and private infrastructure clients. Francisco graduated from Georgetown University and obtained an MBA from the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. And to Francisco's left is Carlos Sánchez. And Carlos is currently located in London, but he's originally from Spain. And he is the Climate Resilience Finance Director at Willis Towers Watson. And he has a master's in finance from the London Business School and a master in international relations from Georgetown University. So there is more. Obviously, they have a lot more experience, but I'm just going to talk about, we want to have more time to talk about the topic at hand today, which is obviously the bankability. So we're going to spend a little time talking about a little history. And one of the nice things about having Jean-Marie here today is not only is he a manager, operations, strategic guy, but he's also an academic, so he brings a little bit of that perspective as well. And so what I want to talk and sort of spend time on, and starting with Jean-Marie, is a little bit of the historical perspective, right? So this is not the first time a country has fallen out of grace in terms of its credit rating, in terms of its ability to access the capital markets. But we have some good stories to tell in terms of the ability to come back from that situation. And Jean-Marie, I would like you to start us off a little bit and talk a little bit about, maybe start with the concept of how has the concept of debt defaults changed over time, and then maybe you can transition a little bit toward the historical perspective in other regions, other geographies.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, and thank you to David for the invitation. Restructuring debt is not new, and even though the numbers are significant in Puerto Rico, before 2000, if we look at Latin America, many of us will recall the haircuts, both short and long, and yet, even during the 2008 global financial crisis, countries like Argentina, Colombia, Mexico were able to secure additional funding to weather the financial storm, with institutions like the World Bank, the Paris Club, and numbers which are not too different to what Puerto Rico is facing today. Latin America as a region secured $90 billion worth of funding from the World Bank, the IDB, amongst others. Even countries like Brazil, which had to go through some regulatory and legislative changes, was able to secure additional funding. When we look at sovereign risk in many of these countries, the multilateral institutions have also changed the definition. So in the past, where aid was excluded, today it's included. So simply by securing additional aid doesn't mean that you get debt relief or even restructuring. And in today's terms, that has improved the quality of the sovereign risk as is judged by the credit risk agencies or the credit rating agencies. Of course, they look at sovereign risk and they look at two primary drivers. What is the ability of the country to meet its obligations? And secondly, what is the willingness? And the willingness, I think, was very well explained and detailed by the governor yesterday in terms of what they're doing in coordinating the legislative framework, in making sure that there's a regulatory framework that is independent, that information is reliable, so that there's confidence in the information that's coming out, and secondly, that the frequency of the information. We heard yesterday that cash flow information is being shared even on a weekly basis. So that kind of information, that commitment to communicating, the May 2018 announcement regarding the sales tax bonds and the revenues being shared with some of the existing GOBs shows that there's communication. And I think that leads back to where in the past that communication improved investor perceptions and therefore the rating that the agencies would have given.
So taking that a little forward and maybe drilling down to sort of what some of the countries have done. Obviously, there have been a number of countries, Brazil, Colombia, who've come back from that situation. You know, can you talk a little bit about what has changed, what these countries did to build back their credit profile and be able to access the credit markets, which they hadn't been able to do in the past?
Almost without exception, these countries moved to ensure the independence of the financial institutions, including the central bank. So political interference, which was quite common, say, prior to 2000, no longer the case. Secondly, the coordination of the legislation, an example of which we heard yesterday in Puerto Rico, how the body of legislation is being coordinated to reinforce those responsibilities, to reinforce the clarity of the rights of investors. In the case of the P3s in Puerto Rico, it's the example of the unsolicited proposals. So those measures, together with taking ownership and responsibility for the fiscal information and making sure that it's communicated, of course, to the citizens, but also to the creditors, brings a certain amount of confidence that translates into improved ratings by the credit risk agencies. And it's that measure of sovereign risk that, for example, when the financial crisis permeated all those economies, not specifically and not directly, but certainly indirectly in 2008, they were able to secure financing through the institutions that we mentioned just now. So those measures helped, and even in a downturn like in 08, those same countries were able to secure additional funding.
So I think that's a message, a very positive message in terms of those countries who had as a severe situation in many cases as what Puerto Rico has, were able to come back, and they have been able to thrive in this new environment that you're describing here. So if we transition over a little bit to Puerto Rico, because I think that's appropriate, and Francisco, who is obviously based in New York, but knows the Puerto Rico market very well. If you could talk a little bit about sort of, leveraging off what Jean-Marie was describing, what are the kinds of projects that you think in Puerto Rico would you think would be bankable, based on the definition that we were discussing?
Sure, good morning. So I think it's helpful to divide the projects in different categories. There's great diversity of projects in Puerto Rico, so it's helpful just to put them in different buckets. The first bucket of projects are those that can receive and use federal funds, and the capital cost of those projects can be repaid from federal sources. I think that those projects will be bankable as long as there is a clear payback structure in terms of giving the money back to the capital providers. And even if the operating cost of those projects is separate, just separating the operating and the capital will be helpful to get those projects off the ground. So that's one category of projects. The second category is those projects that are separate and apart from the general fund and the ongoing restructuring. In yesterday's panels, a lot of those projects were referred to as user fee-based, but the key characteristic is there's some separation between those projects and the ongoing restructuring, and also the source of repayment is self-generated, if you will. Those projects, for example, tend to be projects that the revenues are from, for example, the terminal project that was announced yesterday. The cruise ship terminal project would be an example of that. Then the third and final bucket, in my opinion, is those projects that have some connectivity to the general fund and to the public corporations. And those projects will require some clarity from the ongoing situation, and those tend to be the larger projects. Mm-hmm. And I think that as more clarity come out of the restructuring process, those projects will eventually get financed and presented to the market.
So if you look at that, based on what you described, the kind of projects that you believe will be bankable, right. Obviously they're going to have to go and address the capital markets. They're going to go, obviously, solicit the financing. Can you describe for us, Francisco, a little bit about who do you think are going to be the players and where the financing will be coming from to support these P3 projects going forward? Obviously, from the banking side, I think there is a lot of appetite, right. To pursue what are some of the projects that have been described, and looking at, you know, the source of repayment, the kind of credit enhancements that you could probably bring into the structure. But tell me a little bit about what you think, who are going to be the players, the funding sources they're going to be evaluating these projects.
Sure. So those projects, there's different risk profiles in those projects, right? The ones that with federal funding, either in whole or in part, the projects that have some self-sustaining revenue, and the other projects. Different risk profiles will attract different types of capital. I think that the local banks are clearly a big part of the solution. I think that lenders, as international lenders, as they get clarity on the repayment mechanics or the details around the repayment, will play a role in funding those projects. And I think that capital markets will also play a role, especially on the medium-sized and larger projects. There's a tremendous amount of awareness of the Puerto Rico situation. So, and those who have invested the time to understand the different revenue streams, the different interrelationships between the borrowers or potential borrowers, will have a deeper understanding and deeper willingness to, for the right project, provide the financing.
So some of the, I think, players, investors, or lenders you described are going to look for some credit enhancements.
Sure.
To make this work. And maybe you can spend a moment talking a little bit about what kinds of credit enhancements you would envision in some of these P3 projects.
Sure. So over the years leading up to the current situation, Puerto Rico was a big user of credit enhancements. So some of the more traditional insurance type sources of credit enhancement have been are no longer available, and a lot of the projects that will be successful will depend on either having structural enhancements via low LTVs or substantial amount of reserves, and other projects that utilize creative use of federal funding could also be a form of credit enhancement. And
so maybe you can talk a little bit about that. One of the comments I heard a few times from people yesterday while I was here was it's going to be important to have some kind of federal enhancement or federal funding or whatever you want to call it in terms to support these kinds of transactions. What do you describe, and how would you see that integrating into these P3 financings?
So a lot of that will be ongoing and to be determined, but my understanding is that some of the federal funding have flexibility to be used for economic development, for example, and creating structures or using those funds in creative ways could provide external credit support to some of these projects. The housing industry has been very creative in the use of federal funding, tax credits, et cetera, using those to create bankable projects. And I think that the general infrastructure sector will be looking at the housing model, the federal housing model, and other forms of leveraging federal funds.
Mm-hmm. So I think we all realize that's going to be an important part of what is a successful financing here. Before we move off of Puerto Rico, I'd like to go back to Jean-Marie for a moment and talk a little bit about sort of this promesa issue, right? So we have to deal with that, and that's one of the things that investors are going to look at and lenders are going to look at. And how is that addressing in sovereign risk, and how Puerto Rico is using that, and what do you think in terms of what makes Puerto Rico different when we talk about promesa and the bankruptcy issues and how we should deal with that going forward.
One of the positives of Puerto Rico, of course, is that the repatriation risk and the devaluation risk for creditors is more or less a non-issue. If you look at the rest of the region, primary concerns, for example, in Argentina was the devaluation of the debt in hard currency. And now that the Supreme Court has ruled that Puerto Rico has both the right to issue debt but also to restructure its own debt, in conjunction with the Financial Oversight Board, Puerto Rico has the opportunity to take its future into its own hands. And I think we heard quite a lot from the governor yesterday. As I mentioned earlier, the questions, we heard a lot about the willingness yesterday and some of the measures that have been taken. But of course, questions continue and abound regarding the ability. And I think that's what Francisco was talking about. 72 odd billion with no repayments till at least 2022, based on the governor's comments earlier this year, does raise concerns. And as long as Puerto Rico is able to communicate with its creditors and maintain confidence in its plan, then there should be sufficient windows of opportunity to restructure without, as Francisco says, without putting the crucial infrastructure projects funded through P3s on the back burner, because they have to happen for all the right reasons, but especially for social reasons. The country needs that infrastructure, as the governor said yesterday, not just to replace, but completely to renew. It's a whole renewal process. And I think that's where the P3 opportunities come in. And we'll talk a little bit later about the role of the export credit agencies.
So we'll come back to that in a minute. I'd like to give Carlos a chance to talk a little bit about what he does, because it's very interesting. I think Carlos is bringing a very unique perspective to this conversation, and it's the topic of resiliency. Resiliency is we build the asset, we finance the asset, but an important component of making this work, especially in light of what happened 9 months ago, is to protect the asset. And investors are going to look for a protection level that probably wasn't required before, but now, because of the heightened awareness of potential climate events, people are going to look at that. So, Carlos, if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, what is climate resilience finance for those of us who are not familiar with it, and then maybe talk a little bit about how it might apply to our discussion this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, David, for this great opportunity. Climate resilience finance relates to the mobilization of capital for the protection ex ante of public and private assets and operations from the increasing impact of physical climate risk. As you may notice, there is a very distinctive element within this definition, that is the ex ante part. And I was very glad to witness yesterday how there was a big push for a more proactive, a more on the ex ante part of the story action, and inform those investment decisions at that stage, on the design and structuring phase, and informing how climate risks are going to affect the predictability, the certainty of cash flows and related costs for the life of the asset. Our assumption is that we are in a situation that we could define as a market failure, because currently, as we see, that allocation of capital is very inefficient, and we believe that that's because of the mispricing of physical climate risks. What we aim at doing is to leverage all the risk modeling capabilities from the reinsurance and insurance industry towards a more comprehensive financing of risk. And what does that mean? Of course, I work for a company that has two very well-defined wings, if you want to say, the reinsurance, insurance broking. So on that, there is a wealth of knowledge and experience on how to really inform risk modeling processes. And then there is investment consulting. So it's a very interesting because we are bringing those together to really inform the development of tools that are not aimed at placing insurance, which we believe that is necessary, but it shouldn't be at the forefront of risk management. Insurance should play a new role towards the end, more as a reward mechanism. And I would like to maybe touch a little later on the explosion of insurance-linked securities and parametric insurance products that really are changing a little bit the narrative and if you want to say so, the paradigm on this. So again, getting back into the specific and how it relates to the topic of this conference and of this panel, it has all to do with bankability. I mean, we normally say that we face two challenges. First is how we properly price risk, physical climate risk, for the lifespan of an asset. Myriad of analytical challenges in really providing a reliable projection for what are the costs for that asset for its life. If we do that, then we can inform the investment, but then even if successful with that, we're going to face an even bigger challenge, that is the IRR test. So basically, if we come up with a conclusion that we need to invest 3% more, 4% more, that in net present value considerations may be a disaster. So we don't finish our work there, we work on the need to really bring real incentives and financial incentives that really inform that. And I think that along the lines of what is being mentioned here is very encouraging that there is that awareness that you need the credit announcement, that you need the support to really make that happen. And if you want to say, have that proof of concept.
So if, Carlos, maybe you could talk a little about how infrastructure finance is, and climate risk on infrastructure is different from traditional asset classes.
Yeah, and thank you for that question, because actually that allows me to take a step back and clarify a little bit what is our approach in terms of our work and our market. We have a very much an asset class approach, an investment value chain approach too. So basically, we understand what are perceptions, incentives for action along the investment value chain, and how exposure is felt in different asset classes. So listed equity for both active and passive, we are trying to understand what are the necessary tools to really make those investments in resilience necessary. For corporate and sovereign debt, the same. And then infrastructure. In infrastructure, what we have been very active is engaging with all relevant stakeholders, from governments to rating agencies to multilaterals and to insurance companies, to really understand what are the problems. And what we have come to the conclusion is that there are key issues that need to be addressed. The first one is that we don't have the tools or the methodologies to really make the case for that additional investment to make that resilient. And that is because I think that credit rating methodologies and investment appraisal methods are evolving in a very promising way, but don't properly reflect that consideration. So if you really allocate that capital, you're not going to have that delta capital, you're not going to have that really benefit in terms of cost of capital or discount rate. So that's a critical element. And that for governments, even if it is at a political return level, it's critical. For institutional investors that may go to certain countries where you have the correlation normally of high exposure and presence of other risks other than climate, you have a very tight risk-adjusted return for you to come and say that you need to invest more. So we need to be very realistic, and I think that Laura yesterday, I really like her mention to, we need to be innovative, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we need to be very responsible in what we bring to the market. So in that sense, we want to be very responsible in really what are the solutions. So we have that problem. We have the revenue and the financial case. As you know, investing in resilience is investing in cost avoidance and cash flow protection, not so much on generating a new revenue, which is a huge problem too. So we need to really think about that. We have a problem on deal flow generation, so how you really package a portfolio that you can say that is resilient investment. That is a problem, and ultimately, and I think a combination of these factors is what we call the risk of pricing risk. If we only finish in properly pricing physical climate risk, what we're going to have is maybe less projects. And what we strongly believe is that more than anything, more than any challenge, this is a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity because a massive amount of capital that is locked waiting for this. There is a high level of interest that is not properly informed to be high level of demand. And we are really working towards that. And I think that I must take this opportunity to really highlight that opportunity element to it. Because really having this understanding, and we work a lot with the asset management industry, and having this understanding of exposure, and Jamari was mentioning about sovereign, systemic exposure. So both the macro, the micro, if you have that capacity to understand, it is really powerful. Puerto Rico has a very unique space regionally and in terms of its nature to really become a hub for resilience regionally. So I think it's worth really going towards the opportunity side rather than scaremongering and risk side.
Okay. So if, again, maybe you can integrate a little bit with what tools and instruments can be used specifically in terms of climate resilience. But if you were going to give advice to the process, the person who's managing the P3 process, in terms of climate resiliency and how that can be integrated in, what's the advice that you would provide to make these projects obviously much more bankable?
Yeah, and I think that maybe the two questions are very interrelated. And so in terms of tools and instruments, and based on those challenges that I just mentioned, we believe that there are three pillars of solutions that we need to be promoted and enhanced. The first one is deal flow and cash flow, portfolio generation tools. And for that we need, as Jamari was mentioning, a more systemic thinking. So basically understand and prioritize investments based on the contribution to national value protection. Let me maybe say it another way. So it's understanding how that outer value skeleton in a country that is that critical infrastructure, how it's exposed to physical climate risk, and understand that exposure not as a function of the arithmetic addition of asset value at risk, but understanding that exposure as a function of national value constrained because of that exposure. I think that at that level, we would inform very well prioritization of investment at the national government level and institutional investor level, multilaterals, export credit agencies. That would be very powerful in that sense, because then you can start packaging and selling in a much more powerful way what is resilience. Once you have a prioritization and let's say you identify 5 projects, the next challenge or the second pillar is the design. So what does it mean to invest in those projects in terms of resilience? And in that sense, the idea is to start with what we call a business as usual CapEx. And for that business as usual CapEx, I start understanding how we can draw climate-related OpEx for the life of the asset. So understanding really what is exposure of your cash flows and what are the OpEx needs for the life of the asset. And even breaking that down into hazards. Once you have that, it's only the starting point to have a very informed decision, because then, and in that regard, as I said, analytics are booming in a very promising way. You can start trading unit to unit and say how an additional, very well-informed unit of CapEx is going to have an impact on my OpEx for the life of the asset. So having that design tool that really informs and certifies that that asset is resilient at a certain level, and that's something that is open for discussion. Do you want to have it up for 1 in 200, 1 in 150? That at the end of the day doesn't matter so much, because what we need is a tool that compares apples to apples and to helps inform and prioritize. That will be the second phase, but as we mentioned before, we're going to face the challenge of saying, okay, analytically speaking, is very rigorous, very robust, but financially speaking, this is a disaster, because now we have a higher CapEx. So that's where we go to the third phase, that is attracting capital, resilience capital. So basically, how we can bring capital that understands this improvement in resilience and really facilitates and enhances this asset. And in that sense, as I mentioned before, the emerging and explosion in insurance-type solutions is very promising because that allows us to bring together potentially a capital market instrument that brings together credit and insurance risk. So you can inform a use of proceeds for the investment ex ante and then have this parametric solution for the life of the asset that is going to smooth any impact. And even if that impact is important, you have the provision and the provision for that. Then jumping from the tools and instruments question to how the PPP could really promote this. I think that there is, first of all, there is a procurement bias that affects resilience and kind of builds into the argument of resilience finance being at odds with bankability at current conditions. And it is obvious, procurement bias discarding those projects that may propose a higher investment for those considerations. So really making an effort to integrate risk modeling considerations to inform and to select, that would be really powerful in that regard. Again, resembling the tools, having an idea of a prioritization tool that really helps inform and prioritize project A versus project B and back that decision and that prioritization process in terms of systemic and national value at risk. That would be very, very powerful. And then in general, just promote and foster both positive and negative incentives. And that was another mention from yesterday that I thought it was very valuable in terms of, should we just go the policy route? Should we just go the regulation route? We believe that wouldn't be comprehensive, because then you are only going one side, and you may end up, having crazy debt service coverage ratio for projects, crazy contingency accounts that also destroy bankability at the end of the day. So it's a combination of the pull and push, like bringing capital incentives and also then regulate on that.
Okay, well, so I'm gonna ask Francisco and Jean-Marie to sort of answer the similar question, which is, with all the knowledge you have of the capital markets and of projects that you've worked and structured in the past, what would what one or two things would you recommend that the P3 authority take into consideration as they move forward in this process to make these deals more bankable?
So the government and the P3 authority could be very helpful in creating structures that provide confidence to the lenders and the capital markets, structures that are scalable so that we don't reinvent the wheel for every single project, structures that building flexibility into the financing component of the procurement, right? Understanding that not everything is clear at the outset, but eventually over time there'll be some clarity once certain milestones take place. So having the financing be a dedicated component, just in line with the procurement aspect, the financing has to be elevated to a key component of the selection process.
Okay, and Jean-Marie, can I ask you the same question and maybe talk a little bit about specifically on the credit enhancement side?
Sure. Yesterday we had an introduction into the pipeline that the authority, the P3 authority of Puerto Rico has delivered to date and is working on in the near future. A lot, and listening to some of the conversations yesterday with many of you, the number one expectation is that there's political stability. And if you talk to Moody's, for example, their political risk index weighs political stability at 45% of the total index. That's a lot. And the kind of stability that the governor is bringing, and hopefully will continue into his next term with his administration, builds confidence. But investors are going to come in for a specific project. Francisco went through some of the options. And with Carlos, you have an additional tool in the toolbox with some innovative ways of financing. But at the end of the day, it's the alignment of the strategic projects to the national strategic imperative. So yesterday there were some discussions about energy storage. There were some discussions about the microgrids. That kind of integration, together with the independence of these microgrids, where and when they're required, is clearly a strategic imperative. And investors are going to look where there are some guarantees. Now, whether those guarantees come from, and these are suggestions that have been made on the floor. For example, some of the federal funding that's available, a tranche of that could be kept as some sort of collateral, some sort of guarantee to appease some of the concerns that naturally exist. Secondly, the export credit agencies have a role to play. We heard from quite a few of our Canadian colleagues yesterday, but it would have been great to have seen the Canadian Export Credit Agency here to facilitate that discussion and to learn about how their role is valuable. I mentioned to Michael earlier, I spent many years in Russia. The role, we couldn't get financing without the export credit agencies. And in those cases, we were working with COFAS and with Hermes from France and Germany. And without their role, that financing would not have occurred and the investments wouldn't have been realized. We had really no alternative. So I think the learning here is the P3 authority of Puerto Rico has ticked a number of the boxes, and there are a few still to go. For example, the role of the export credit agencies. And I think it would be wonderful to see the governor and perhaps Omar present, for example, at the Canadian P3 conference in November. The export credit agencies will be there, as will many of the representatives from the capital markets. And it's really going to the market and putting forward your proposal on the front stage, not necessarily in your home stage. So those are some of the ideas that were discussed by many of you on the floor yesterday, which I thought had value.
Well, thank you to our three panelists. Do you have something, Francisco?
Yeah, just very quickly. Obviously there are a lot of people, there are a lot of projects, and the needs are great. But in terms of things that could be done is trying to de-risk some of the financing. And I think that by doing some of the pre-work ahead of the procurement and lay it all out in the RFQ or the feasibility study, I think the market could digest better what are the financing options. It's not very practical for everybody to try to come up with the creative way or the solutions. That's really not optimal. But if it's a key part of some of these studies, I think that the market can then digest what are the financing options. And even if it's not clear 100% out of the box, eventually putting that information out there, doing the pre-work, de-risking could also be super helpful.
Well, thank you three. I wanted to leave maybe time for one or two questions. I don't know if we have any questions from the group. We do. Okay.
Yes, you have questions. So we have gathered a couple of questions. First of all, thank you. A very interesting panel. Thank you to all of you for the great panels.
Thank you.
We had collected 3 questions from the floor. I think I'm going to read them loud because I think some of the questions include the one that include Michael as from moderator to panelist now. So I'm going to read them and then I'm passing to you, Michael. So let me start with the first one. It's about local mechanisms to support bankability. And it reads as follows. It says, in the past, the government of Puerto Rico had the Government Development Bank, which is kind of similar to a central bank, to support projects. Again, the premise is the following. In the past, the government of Puerto Rico had the Government Development Bank to support projects. The Government Development Bank is no longer available. What ideas of local mechanisms to support projects should the government consider? What ideas of local mechanisms should the government consider now that it does not have the Government Development Bank available?
Okay, well, so that, starting with a fast pitch, but we'll take that. I think, just to give you sort of my opinion, if I'm going to be a panelist just for the moment, I am here in Puerto Rico, I think the administration, just because the Government Development Bank is no longer here, does that mean that they're not willing, and I think they've been very clear on this, to support projects that make a lot of sense. And they have, there's been a lot of press lately in terms of making these incentive programs, whether it be tax credits or other programs, making them much more geared towards projects that over the long term have a substantial economic benefit to Puerto Rico, and they've been much more diligent in managing, and they will be going forward more diligent in managing the costs of those kinds of programs. So I do see, even in the absence of the Government Development Bank, that there will be some role of the administration will play and the government will play in supporting projects, but it may not be obviously through the Government Development Bank. Certainly we're looking at projects that may require some kind of support. I don't know if there's any comments from any of the three panelists that you want to add in terms of what, the absence of the Government Development Bank. We did talk about structural enhancements versus outside credit enhancements. Either Jean-Marie, Carlos, any comments that you want to add on that?
I may actually abuse of this question to raise a flag, because I wanted to really bring to the conversation the very powerful dynamics that are being created in the UK with the Green Finance Task Force, and how this green enhancement discussion is being discussed increasingly between players or stakeholders that before were not in the table, and I think that capital providers, insurance companies are talking about this. So I think it would be worth being very aware. I think that I'm no one to represent, and we have representatives here of the UK government, but Willis has been the chair of the insurance work stream within the Green Finance Task Force, and there's going to be a lot on that side of the story, of the climate again, but it's narrow but very important on that, and there's a lot of discussions on how you could fill that space there.
Good, okay. That's an interesting, important topic. Moving on, this one is directed to all the panelists. It's about resiliency, and it reads as follows. How can Puerto Rico elevate the resiliency narrative so government, bankers, and other stakeholders take it more seriously? How can, again, the question is, how can, Puerto Rico or the resiliency narrative be elevated so government, bankers, and all the stakeholders take it more seriously? And that's directed to all the panelists.
You want to start?
Let me start then with that. First of all, it's very encouraging that discussion about resilience has evolved in a way that I'm in this panel today. I think that a few years ago, I would be the last person to be included in a panel like this, because resilience at some point was almost an esoterical conversation. We're involved in a way that now we are facing the real challenge, that is to really to compel to all those stakeholders that you just mentioned, that are the critical ones. You go nowhere without them. It's about making the real case, the rigorous, robust financial case for resilience. That is not anymore those, and sometimes it's being mixed with a little bit of sustainability and ESG considerations. No, resilience is a very straightforward, objective, and rational consideration that we need to properly embed within investment processes. But that would be the direction, is rigor in the analytics, and showing to these stakeholders that there is a financial case, that there is no so much discussion around. It's just very objective and rational.
Okay.
You know, I agree with Carlos. I mean, it's kind of in an organic way, it's become part of the everyday discussions around projects and bankability. I think the procurement processes have incorporated resiliency, and I think that it's had an impact on the construction design, but also on the projections and forecasts. Right? What are we doing to ensure this is a resilient project, minimize risk of whether that's flooding or hurricane. This is more and more is becoming part of the conversation, and I think that public policy officials are playing a role in maintaining and increasing the conversation level. So,
yeah, the value for money analyses that is obviously required in a P3 project that both of you referred to in terms of the analytics are more operational today so that those assets are resilient. It does need to take into account the OPEX, not just the CAPEX, and how the utilization of that asset will ensure its resilience. So, the financial analytic process, the value for money, for example, that we do, must take into account the resilience of the asset. Otherwise, it's not delivering what it should. And Francisco makes an excellent point. That transparency, let's take a P3 project. There is a value for money exercise. They usually take 3 to 6 months. We saw yesterday from Marco, from the Canadian P3 Authority, how those results, without the confidential information, are available on the website. It's transparent. People can go and learn from them, but it also transmits confidence that the process itself is resilient because it is transparent. And that value for money exercise is critical in the P3 process. And I think for Puerto Rico, that commitment that we heard yesterday will ensure that those projects are resilient.
Okay, good. That's an important topic too. Okay, this is the last question. If there's any other question from the audience, this is the time. Write down your question and pass it. I want to make sure. Okay, last question that we have here is a tough one, I think, and it's directed to all the panelists again, and it's related obviously to bankability, and it reads as follows: under the circumstances of Puerto Rico, should Puerto Rico consider pledging or transferring property to the private sector to help projects be bankable? Again, under the circumstances of Puerto Rico, should Puerto Rico consider pledging or transferring property to the private sector to make those projects more bankable? That is the question directed to all the panelists. I guess you distribute it as according to the moderator's order. I don't know.
So my feeling is, that is an alternative if it works under a legal structure that we're talking about today, which is PROMESA, right? So most public assets today, I would imagine, are not readily available to be transferred outside of the framework of PROMESA. So if they were available, I think that's something they have to consider. You can put that on the list of alternatives for credit enhancement, but that may be one alternative, obviously, that would have to be considered on a legal basis.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's an alternative. There's obviously a tension between public policy goals and the amount and level of collateral security you provide the private sector to finance an asset. So, it's an alternative. I think that there's going back to the types of projects, every project is different. So on some projects that may not be required, others may be more of a consideration for other projects.
Okay. All right. Questions keep coming. Next one is, can you comment on the impact of federal loan guarantees as part of leveraging recovery assets on the bankability of P3 projects. So let me read it again. Can you comment on the impact of federal loan guarantees as part of the leveraging the recovery assets on the bankability of P3 projects? I think you comment a bit about this, but it seems to be going back to the loan guarantees again.
Yeah, no, so there are a number of federal programs that provide guarantees. A lot of those programs have their own credit thresholds, and what we found in the past is that sometimes it's not necessarily a substitute for bankability, and just going to the federal government, you still have to have some minimum level of rentability or revenue producing. So it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. Some programs could be helpful, especially as more clarity is obtained from the ongoing restructuring process. I think that some of the energy programs that the DOE has and the Agricultural Department has could be coupled with PPAs, and those types of projects can get executed. But there has to be some clarity on the revenue source. So we go back to kind of like what's the type of project? How are you going to repay the capital? What's the revenue? User fees? Is it more of a federal funding source, which obviously that will be also a form of federal help, right?
Okay, good. Thank you for that. Okay, next question, and the last one we have for now is the following. It's more directed to the research and what is the literature out there about bankability. And it says, can you share the success stories or any in-depth added value or research from recognized universities associated with bankability of PPP projects? So the question is, what research and what universities have been producing sufficient research about bankability of PPP projects that you guys are aware of?
Well, the World Bank is a major contributor to that research. Many of you will have read Kaufman, Matarusi, and others. And it all comes back to the discussion used to be about the capital projects and the capital funding. We were discussing it earlier, that the research has broadened to include things like culture. And it's given a different perspective. When I majored with economics and finance, a lot of people said to me, why did you waste your time in psychology? Well, it's interesting that today some of those learnings have come home to roost. Many P3s will succeed, notwithstanding the structure and the risk profiles and who mitigates the best against the strengths that they have in the P3s. But it's also the alignment of the cultures. And we have a number of projects at the moment in Latin America where more preparation and more understanding and better quality learnings of the culture mix would have generated a sustainable, more sustainable P3, or a more resilient P3 if we talk about the resilience of the assets, but the resilience of the project. So the research is out there, the IFC, the World Bank, IDB, a lot of research on P3s. But I think it's also important to see how that research has broadened out. It's a sort of Me Too moment in the research, and it's taken in what we were talking yesterday about the soft side of the deals, that they are now finding much more relevance and recognition in the research.
Good. Thank you for that. Yeah.
If I may, and again, bias towards the resilience element of the conversation and research. I have to raise again the UK flag because, again, we are going in a direction where risk analytics are meeting bankability and PPPs. And again, there was a proposal to the UK government to create the Centre for Risk Analytics in the UK, trying to really bring together all the research that is existing on infrastructure, network modeling, which is a very important element to the solution of systemic risk and sovereign risk. So it is really evolving in a very promising direction. There is a task force on infrastructure, PPPs, and resilience, and it's really just going in that direction, which is very promising because traditionally it's been the science has been going one direction and talking past each other to the investment community. So in that, I think it's to be aware of future developments in that sense.
Good. Yeah, definitely research is part of the ecosystem to advance the entire topic. So in a meeting the other day, I was about Puerto Rico, they said bankability was the gorilla in the room, and I think you had taken on the gorilla in the room. So thank you very much to all the panelists for this. Thank you, Michael, Jean Marie, Francisco, and Carlos. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very insightful. Thank you very much.